Hi there, Steve Kaufman here, talking about language learning, talking about the contradictions inherent in language learning. If you enjoy these videos, please subscribe, and if you feel like it, give me a like if you enjoy this video. So recently I made a couple of videos which generated feedback, which I always appreciate. One was on pointing out that some of elements of coercion, in other words, very specific, almost mechanical, short-term goals, targets, like creating 100 links in each of the languages I'm studying, is very effective and enables me to work my way through content that I would otherwise find either too difficult or not very interesting. So people said, well, you used to say, you know, what happened to enjoying it and comprehensible input? So there's a contradiction there. But the explanation is, first of all, I'm entitled to change my views on things, although I must say I've been quite consistent. What I wrote in my book 15 years ago, before I had ever heard of Stephen Krashen, still remains true. And that is that the best way to learn is to engage with content of interest, lots of listening and reading. However, the reality is that when you start in a language, nothing is comprehensible. So you can't start with comprehensible input. And that's where we have our mini stories that link with lots of repetition, verbs, high frequency verbs, changing their forms. And I find that extremely useful to get started in a language. I didn't have mini stories 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. So that has changed. I believe in those, even though they're not inherently, intrinsically interesting or compelling. The second thing is, once you have done the mini stories, and that's where I am in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, then even though there are still areas that I don't understand and things that I continue to forget, still, it's a kind of a comfortable area. To get from that comfort zone into the stuff that I really want to be able to understand, such as political discussions on the internet, is a long road. And when I'm in those difficult transcribed podcasts, for example, with lots of unknown words, it's difficult. It can be frustrating. And so then I have had a tendency to go back to my mini stories because I can do those. And so I found that by forcing myself to create 100 links, I was able to force myself to plow forward into these inherently difficult texts. And I know from experience that in time they will become more comprehensible and more enjoyable. I also found that some of the content that we had in our link library, which wasn't inherently interesting, but where at least the transcript is accurate, because when I'm transcribing podcasts, very often the transcripts are not accurate. Another element of frustration. So if I go back into content in our link library in Persian or Arabic, it may not be as interesting as the Al Jazeera or France 24 podcast, but if I say, okay, my goal is to save 100 links, I can go in there and I find that an enjoyable activity to the extent that I achieve what I set out to do. And I know that in time, I will be able to enjoyably listen to the political podcasts. I know that because, for example, when I started into Ukrainian, I had nothing. And today, with the events, that, you know, the impeachment trial or whatever, discussions in the US Senate, Ukraine is in the news every day. And so I wanted to listen to a Ukrainian podcast. So I went there and I just understand it. Haven't listened to Ukrainian for months and months and months, and I go in there and I understand it. So that's kind of reassuring. You know, if you put the effort in, because it used to be that the Ukrainian podcasts were as difficult to understand as the Arabic podcasts are today. So to that extent, it's a contradiction, but I find it's a way of pushing myself into more difficult content, or even doing less interesting content, which is continuing then to have this process of the language, you know, enter my brain. So that's that contradiction. Then there was the contradiction over how close can we get to the native accent? Obviously, our goal is to imitate the native. Imitate how the native uses words, imitate the native pronunciation. The more we are in empathy with the native, the better we're going to learn, and the better our pronunciation will be. However, I said, it's unlikely that we will be mistaken for a native. And I say that because the only language I can judge is English. And in all my years of dealing with people who are non-native speakers of English, I don't think I've met one person who learned English as an adult who can be mistaken for a native. Such people may exist, and there are people in the comment section saying, I know so-and-so, and he or she, sounds just like a native. Maybe there are those people. I haven't met them. Eventually, something gives them away. It's like the old expression, you can fool some of the people all of the time, or all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. So the native has so much exposure to the language, and it's so natural to them, that it's, to my mind, unrealistic to expect that you will achieve that level of proficiency, including pronunciation, in another language. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, and the closer you get, the better. And obviously, the greater your empathy and the greater your willingness to step out of your native culture, the better you will do. So, but there is a contradiction there. We try to be like the native, and yet we're unlikely to achieve it. Another contradiction, in a way, is that the more we study something, like declension tables or the rules of the subjunctive, the more we try to nail it down, the less well we learn it. If we spend our time engaging with the language, hearing the language, moving around to different levels of difficulty of content, occasionally looking at the rules or the tables, that's a faster path. We will be more successful at learning all those nuts and bolts of the language than if we deliberately try to learn them. So that, in a sense, is another contradiction. Another contradiction is, sort of contradiction. People often say, well, I understand well, but I can't speak. And I find that not to be the case, even for those people who say that it is the case. Because in so many cases, I've challenged people who say that. And I say, well, you understand well, then can you comfortably read novels in the language? The answer is no. Do you understand movies? No. I knew a Swedish lady who spoke French quite well. And so I gave her a gift of an audiobook, French literature. She said she couldn't understand it. So when we get our comprehension to a level where we can read novels, understand audiobooks, the speaking will come. And conversely, many of the people who say they don't speak well, in fact, speak well enough. They're too critical of their own efforts. If we look at the goal of language learning as being comprehension, first of all, and then the ability to communicate, that doesn't mean you have to communicate with no mistakes or communicate in a native-like accent. Just communicate. If that's the goal, then put your major effort on comprehension, because the speaking will come. An example of that is our school system in Canada, where in the traditional system, they teach the language, they teach the grammar, they teach kids to speak for 10 years, and at the end of 10 years, they can't speak. A contradiction. Whereas kids who are in French immersion, like my grandchildren, they have all their subjects in French. So the focus is on comprehension. They have to understand, whether it be social sciences or maths or whatever, physics, in French. They don't speak very well. I know my grandchildren, they don't speak French. They can kind of speak, but they don't speak very well. But they have good comprehension. And the many examples of immersion kids who go to a French-speaking environment, and very quickly they speak very, very well. So the contradiction, in a sense, is if you want to speak well, don't spend your time trying to speak. You're better off to focus on comprehension. And then when you speak, don't worry about it. Yeah, I can't remember. I had a few other things noted down insofar as sort of contradictions in language learning. But there you have it. I appreciate getting your feedback. And I should also remind you that I do have my 10 email course, 10 tips on language learning. If you would like to receive this free of charge, please click on the link. And that's what I had to say today. And if there are things that I say where I contradict myself, I can always fall back on the statement, do as I say, not as I do. My teacher used to say that. Bye for now.